We're aided in everything we do by Priya Nambra, who is our tech wizard, and also the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. Now, among her many responsibilities, one of the simplest is circulating the sign-in sheet, which is currently going around the room. And we ask all of you who are present to add your names. And if you're not already on the listserv and would like to be, please add your email addresses. Far more importantly and more complexly, for all of you who are joining us remotely, Priya is the person who ensures that you can hear and see us, and that when the time comes for you to join the discussion, that we can hear and see you. So please make yourselves known, whether by writing something in the chat or even better, by using the raise hand function on your computers so that we may call upon you directly. And if any of you people attending remotely also would like to be added to the listserv, Priya can handle that as well. Just send her your email address and she will make sure that you get our weekly updates. Now, I have a confession to make. I know that whenever I enter the supermarket, I can take a shortcut to a corner of my own private hell by turning into the aisle where the paper towels are sold. I'll stand there every time, fretting over whether to buy the house brand or one of those whose very names promise plenitude or long life or a kind of muscularity to which I will never aspire. So do I buy the package that offers the equivalent of 8 rolls in 6, or do I simply buy the 8 outright? Do I want single or double ply, recycled or new? The ones whose perforations give me towels of the same square size every time, or the ones that offer the option of tearing off half a towel or even 1.5 towels at a single go? And what about the price per square foot of toweling? Is cheapest best, or does one get in the added absorbency of the quick picker uppers what one is willing to pay for? So now I'm frozen in place and in indecision, even as I think at some level that it's my absolute right as a shopper to have this baffling smorgasbord of options before me. And even as I know that I would judge any store that didn't offer me so many choices to be the wrong place to be shopping for paper towels. And to be real, even as I know that the stakes here are so low as to be practically non-existent. With difficulty and after way too much time, I will put a package of paper towels into my cart. Don't ask me which, because frankly, I don't remember from one time to the next. But in the knowledge that new hell awaits me as I progress down the aisle toward the toilet paper and the paper napkins. Now, I glean from a passing reference in her introduction to the Age of Choice that at some point, Sophia Rosenfeld may have gone through something similar to this when shopping for shampoo. Unlike me, however, she's thought deeply about how we got there as consumers, about why my paralysis and sense of entitlement in the paper goods aisle is not totally idiotic, about how that entitlement is somewhat precarious, and about where the choice of which kitchen product to buy actually sits on a continuum that moves upward and outward to our ability to choose what we eat in a restaurant, whom we love and how, what professions we follow, how we live in civil society. The Age of Choice is a book that makes us see with startling clarity how things that are so present that we likely take them for granted were not ever thus, how they actually do have a history, how the trivial moves into the momentous, and how this history of the plethora of choices available to us cannot and must not ever be separated from its opposite, the history of the restrictions of choice that have been and continue to be imposed on people based on geography, economic status, ethnicity, gender. So what really is at stake beyond toilet paper and shampoo? In a passage from early on in the book that seems at the present moment at once achingly reasonable, alarmingly urgent, and somewhat poignant, Sophie Rosenfeld writes, "Indeed, it follows that if more and better choices on the part of more people is considered the desired effect of good policy in what we now call liberal democracies, good policy depends on the aggregated but democratically determined choices of individual citizens." According to the liberal political theorist John Rawls, people cannot and should not be expected to agree on preferences, aspirations, or even the conditions for good life. However, they can agree on the need for the state to establish stable institutions by which to adjudicate equitably among different and conflicting goals. And they can agree on the process. Democratic theory turns today on the idea of the individual citizen as a rational maker of personally sound choices who has consented, largely out of self-interest, to follow a set of collectively prescribed choice-making rules and to live by the results. Ideally, these results will guarantee the further expansion of personal choice, albeit with certain necessary, if often controversial, limits going forward. End quote. So Sophia Rosenfeld, as many of us know, is Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she has taught European and American intellectual and cultural history with an emphasis on the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolutions since 2017. Prior to coming to Penn, she held positions at the University of Virginia and at Yale. She is the recipient of the Ordre des Palmes Académiques bestowed by the government of France and is the recently past chair of the Penn History Department, as well as past vice president of the American Historical Association and one-time holder of the Kluge Chair in Countries and Cultures of the North at the Library of Congress, among many, many other things. She's the author of The Problem of Signs in Late 18th-Century France, which was published by Stanford in 2001, Common Sense, A Political History, published by Harvard in 2011 and winner of the Society for the History of the Early American Republic Book Prize, Democracy and Truth, A Short History, which was published by Penn Press in 2019, and of course, The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in the Modern World, published by Princeton in 2025, which is, of course, the project from which this evening's presentation emerges. So please join me now in welcoming Sophie Rosenfeld, who will be speaking today on the Age of Choice technology. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. Tell me if I'm not loud enough or something, because I'm not sure. Thank you, Jerry, for a very lovely introduction. And it's interesting that it's the paper towels. People have to tell me that it's, you know, the most common one is probably toothpaste, because they all look kind of the same. And occasionally it's cereals, breakfast cereals, for which, you know, usually there's an entire aisle of sorts. So, but paper towels is a good one. And yes, this is a kind of classic image, right, of the person. If you want to illustrate being overwhelmed with choice, most of the time you put a befuddled looking person in front of a row of something like paper towels. So I can envision the whole thing. Thank you all for being here. This is an unusually nice audience to see because it has so many people in it that I'm delighted to see here. Thank you all for coming. And thank you most of all to the organizers and to Priya for the invitation to be here and for getting this off the ground. And of course, to the wonderful John Pollock, who has found some extraordinary things, one of which I'm going to begin with in a moment, for everybody to look at. So don't leave without looking what's on the table, because it's a really good set of things. And my thank you this case is sort of more than the perfunctory one where where you sort of say thank you for organizers, because in fact, it's only because this library does so many cool things that I came across a number of important things for the project. And one of them was, I stumbled upstairs here, as one does, to see the show and tells that start the beginning of each school year, as far as I know. Was there one this year?
Coming up.
Okay. There's this wonderful kind of event. If you haven't been, you need to go, because John and Lynn and others put out great stuff to look at. New acquisitions, random things in a sense. But there, several years ago, was this extraordinary menu from a French restaurant, circa 1800, we don't know exactly, right? More or less, but certainly within the first decade of these establishments existing. And somehow it was a kind of one of those moments where you think, not only would that be a good illustration, but this is a kind of moment where you think, this is an important example for the whole thing I'm trying to think through. Sometimes that just happens, serendipity. For graduate students in the room, a lot of research is serendipity, always. In any case, the object, which I'm now going to show you, It's on the table too, but if you want to see the slide, I just have to make sure I can do this. Let's see, share. And here. And is this it? So far, oh, wait, we're almost there, promise. There we go. And one more. Okay, we're there. On the one hand, this object, though it's quite large over there, it's this big, you can't help but be struck how ordinary looking it is. In fact, it looks like what we call menus. They were bills of fare in their moment, but it's a long list of dishes in categories that one could order. There it is.
A little more useful.
Thank you. And there's another, John has pulled out also another slightly earlier menu, one of the very first actually, though it doesn't have the sort of spectacular form this one does. But why is this interesting? On the one hand, it made me think that the menu has been a largely stable form for a very long time. And of course, we still metaphorically use menus all the time. Computers bring you into menus for all sorts of things. But at the time that these menus were created, people were marked upon them because they're extraordinary in a way. And what's extraordinary about them? It's not that nobody had ever eaten food outside of their house before. Certainly people had everywhere. People had gone to inns and there was a collective meal that took place. But the restaurant promised something different. It promised that you could ask for individualized portions of something that you wanted to eat at the same time as somebody else who might want to be eating something different, someone you knew or somebody you didn't, but that each of you could have a kind of interior preference for something and order it at the same time, and it would be made and delivered specially to you. We're pretty used to this. I bet you almost everybody in this room has done something like that today. If you didn't order a coffee somewhere from a menu, you ordered something else, you ordered a book in the library. But this was a new technology. And what's so interesting about this menu is that it's both an advertisement for the plentiful choices on offer, and it's a kind of finding aid. It's a choosing aid. It's a way to actualize a choice. Some of the early ones come with a pencil, and you put a little check or a little X to indicate what you've selected. And the menu exists along with this new institution, the restaurant, to make this feasible. So I take this to be a kind of emblem here, and I'm using it today. I don't discuss it in depth in the book at all, but I'm using it as an emblem today of a kind of something that happens at a certain moment that has expanded exponentially into our own time, but that is not a universal, in that this was a new technology in its moment. It's not something one finds regardless of time and place around the world as one might expect to today. Since that moment, the number of opportunities for choice, the number of options before us has expanded not only in sheer numbers, but across so many of the different domains of our lives. You can think of everything from voting in elections to selecting songs you want to hear, to picking friends and partners, to, we call it shopping period in many institutions when you pick your courses. Yeah, I could go on with the examples. But it's not just the number either. It's also the significance of the act itself has changed. Increasingly, 20th century being the sort of apex of this, I'll come to in a moment, we've thought of this process as being an essential form of freedom, if not the form of freedom of choice and freedom as essentially synonymous ideas. There are two upsides to this, the way most theorists have thought about this in the modern world. One, you choose something, you get what you want, whether that's another person or something to eat for dinner. The other is, by choosing, I'm an autonomous adult person. I'm the kind of person who sees myself as independent and other people take me to be independent. And this idea is so dominant in our world that it runs across a strange array of things, from advertising, promotional materials, to human rights charters and constitutions. The notion that choosing is how we actualize ourselves as people.
And finally, if the first idea is that the quantity and the range shifts, the second is that this has some connection to freedom. The third is that the very nature of choice itself shifts from a moment before this menu to something that looks like this. I'm going to give you another example. Here's a classic image of choosing in the Western tradition, the choice of Hercules. And you'll notice that this motif runs, many of you will know this, Bach and Handel, Wedgwood pottery, garden design in England, poetry, Shaftesbury. John Adams suggested it as perhaps a good idea for the Great Seal of the new United States. It's a dominant motif in the 18th century in the Western world. And you'll see that Hercules in the middle, he's kind of torqued, right? He's sort of, he's trying to make up his mind a little bit. But in the end, what is he choosing between? It's allegorical, between virtue and vice, both embodied as women. And in the end, needless to say, Hercules always ends up looking towards virtue. He's tempted by vice, but he does the right thing. That's the kind of classic vision of choice. It was often assimilated with Christian notions of free will to represent how one might think ideally about choice. You'll notice I picked an early 18th century image because I want to contrast it with this, which also starts to emerge in the 18th century. A print after Fragonard of a coquette. The most obvious difference here is obviously, the painting is lost or I would have shown it. The centerpiece has now become a woman who's picking between two men rather than the inverse. And though she's dressed like a shepherdess, she's supposed to be a very modern type. And she too is kind of leaning in two directions. She's trying to think about what she really likes. But what's so interesting here is that there's no value given to those two choices. One is not better than the other. She just has to pick what she likes. She's the coquette, and that's a type. You find it in 18th century literature, a lot of, generally not very good things happen to her. But nevertheless, the coquette is somebody who's having a little trouble making up her mind. Does she like this ribbon or that boy or that boy? And here we see her. In some ways, this is the logic. I'm going to come back to the supermarket aisle here. This is the logic of, do I like the 3-ply or do I like the quicker picker upper, or the supermarket, Tinder, a variety of kinds of modes in which its preference, value neutral choices have replaced kind of morally weighted choices as an ideal of sorts. Okay, what's interesting, I think, is that this notion of choice as freedom in this form is central to both modern democracy, human rights ideas, and to consumer culture, capitalism in its modern form. At this point, what started as a kind of more specific set of ideas in this 18th century formulation is essentially global. It operates in different ways in different places. It's resisted in some, it's absorbed in others, it's modified in yet more, but there are not that many places on earth that are simply untouched by this combination of consumer culture and democratic theory. Think of all the places that hold elections today, even when they're kind of a sham in various ways. That's the big story of this book, The Age of Choice. And I think it hasn't gotten, the story itself hasn't gotten all the attention that it might, this story about choosing, in some ways because it's hidden in plain sight. It's so much the way we operate that it's hard to kind of tease out the natural and the invented at different moments. My goal became both telling this story and a slightly more normative one, which maybe is a little unusual for a historian, which is to say, figuring out when this has been a great advance and when this hasn't, when liberation has taken the form of choice opportunities, which it certainly has at various moments, and when choice has actually resulted in something quite different from freedom, either at the individual level or collectively. I'm not going to say as much as I might normally about the normative part, but if anybody wants to discuss it, I'd be happy to. But in keeping with the premise of this seminar, I thought I'd go in a different direction. I thought I'd say more about the historical part and particularly about sources and methods, since that's what takes us back to these objects like the menu that are on the table in front of us. And I'll show you some in a moment. The puzzle, and when you're, if like me, you're interested in ideas that are kind of ubiquitous, you might call them doxic ideas or just tacit ideas. The problem is generally, how do you write about them? Because they're sort of everywhere. And maybe that's why this book took me so many years. It took me a while to figure out how to isolate something that would let me tell this big story in a way. And I started with a few precepts that I thought would kind of help organize this. And I think this will take us back to the menu and other things like it. I'll tell you about three of them. I won't tell you about all of them. The first one was a kind of pluritemporalism, by which I mean letting myself as a historian, violate some of the rules, jumping around in time a bit, letting the past illuminate the present illuminate the past, and sometimes thinking of stories that are discontinuous, letting kind of layers of things happen. So that was the first, to sort of get out of the straitjacket of time a little bit. The second was to think about the people left out of this paradigm as much as the people who were at the center of it. Because sometimes the view from the margins helps you see what's hard otherwise to see. And I could have told this story a variety of ways. Late in the game, I thought children would have been a great way to do this, the way they're sort of trained to make choices but left out of a lot of others. I thought about doing this from the perspective of thinking about slavery and abolitionism and the changing understandings of freedom that came with that. But finally, I settled on the idea of writing about women, and starting with women actually of some social standing. But why? Well, in some ways, women, strangely, are the paradigmatic first modern choosers. Our coquette, for instance, is operating in a very different world than this more moralized humanist existence of Hercules and his followers. But as choice becomes more important to more domains in this modern form, women are increasingly left out, especially political choice, of course, but all kinds of other economic choices and other ways. And women's aspirations start organizing themselves in the age of liberalism around asking for or demanding choices in new domains. Suffrage is one example, but all the way up to reproductive rights, which is the sort of place I get to at the end. Women let you see, in some ways, the way choice works, exclusions, possibilities. And I thought in the end, they get me back to that central question of when choice is liberating and when it's not. That's the second precept, the margins part. The third one, though, is the most important for what we're talking about now, I think. And that has to do with, where do doxic ideas come from, as opposed to the kinds of ideas that we generally fight over all the time. And my strong sense, the more I thought about this, is that the traditional modes of the intellectual historian, which is to work through great texts, couldn't really explain how conceptions of freedom became so different and so widespread over such a long period of time. It couldn't be just reading Kant and reading Mill. There had to be, something had to have happened. Not to say that Kant and Mill aren't very important to the story, they are. But there had to be some kind of triangulation between thinking, language, and doing. And so I decided that I had to look to see if there were social practices in particular that made a reconceptualization of freedom possible, that made somebody like Mill arguing for, the possibility of charting one's own path and free choice even resonate, even make sense to anyone. I don't think it would have a century or earlier. So I tried to look for social practices that involve something like this menu, which is to say, situations in which somebody had to think, what are my options? What are my preferences among those options in a kind of interior way, based on whatever criteria? They could be anything from social expectations to moral values, to price, to family expectations. There are any range of possible things one might think through and make in determining those preferences. And then one had to do something external to, in a sense, actualize those preferences. They had to ask for something or put an X somewhere or perform some kind of behavior. And I got interested in how this happened at a very micro level. What spaces? Generally, there were special spaces for making these kinds of choices. They happened almost exclusively in what we now call free time, meaning not on the job, because most of the time, we might be the exception in this room. We don't have a lot of power to make a lot of choices about our preferences all day long in the workplace. Most people do as they're told in the workplace. But in other domains, the idea of free time is that you have choice. And all of these things came with a lot of rules and regulations. None of these practices emerged just because we got rid of the context around them. Quite the opposite. They needed more and more regulation to work, both formal and informal, from standards of taste to laws. And they needed to be performed, and people had to learn how to do them. I use the metaphor in a way of choreography, and that sounds maybe a little highfalutin or something, but I really mean that we know how to, when you're in the supermarket, you actually are doing a whole set of actions and behaviors. You've internalized it, but you know that you get the cart, you go over there, you go to the aisle with the paper towels, you load them in, you drive your cart back around to the checkout. There's a whole ballet to it, in a sense. And so I decided that if I could isolate the moment when these new kind of practices emerged, that I might have some way at getting at how this choice stuff got off the ground, and then go back into the larger political and philosophical currents and things. So how do you find social practices with ideological effects? That's a question for graduate students too. It's hard. You start reading very widely, right? I started looking at everything from newspapers to how-to manuals, diaries, sermons, images, and works of philosophy. But there were two sources for this that were particularly important. And they were important because they were actually part of the story themselves. One was novels. For the literature people out there, this will seem absolutely obvious, but novels themselves were products, of course, of new kinds of markets. The novel emerges as a commercial entity, especially the realist novel, especially novels for women, in just the period we're talking about, 17th into 18th centuries. And soon there's all kinds of choice technology associated with it, library catalogs, booksellers, listings, lending libraries. Philadelphia is good for looking at all of this. But it's not just that it's also that the novel from early on, and anybody wants to challenge me on this because there's some literature people in the room, that's good, thematizes choice. It actually is the genre about choice. Most realist novels have a hero or often a heroine at the center who's torn between something one desires and something one feels one must do. Obligations of various kinds, to family, to others, to social expectations. And the realist novel has this marvelous way of, and this is just as this is being invented, of getting inside the head, potentially, of that protagonist. And the reader can watch somebody kind of grappling with how to make the choice, what the right choice is, debating the pros and cons of different pathways. And then the reader has the satisfaction of seeing the consequences, both psychological and material, that result from the choice. So the novel gave me something that's very hard to find elsewhere, which was a kind of way into the psychology of choosing as it emerged. But simultaneously, there's another product of print culture we don't think very much about, like menus, that was the other clue. And I'm going to look at some of these in a moment. In addition to the choosers, there were choice architects, to borrow the language of behavioral economists. And choice architects are the people who essentially design the menus, the rules, the options, how to actualize them. And often the technologies that go with them. And I started looking for things like this menu, essentially paper, usually, at least early on. Now they're less often paper. I would call them micro technologies, many of them ephemeral, but not entirely. Many of them still show signs of their use. You can see, people marking them to do different things with them. And again, they're both part of the story is the invention of these new modes, and they're a source for recovering those modes now, for reconstructing the history of choice. So I'm going to give you a little slideshow of some of them, just because I think, they're fun to look at, and they're also pretty revealing. Early on, catalogues for auctions are very important. This one was offered by Christopher Koch, major auctioneer in 18th century London. And you'll see it looks a lot like the cover of a novel from that era. I think that's not accidental. He invents many of the great sales techniques that will go on to matter to this. The idea of holding days for display, where you just came by and looked at the goods, that he set them up in lots. He organized this notion of bidding on distinct lots. And he invented this idea to whet people's appetites, but also to abet the process of handing out. Sometimes they were free, sometimes you had to pay a little bit. He tells you how to get them here. These little brochures that gave sumptuous descriptions, in many cases, all of the different possibilities on offer. So early on, I think, and he uses the language of choice a lot too, which is to say, early on, the technology and the action start to coincide. Many of these catalogs have been preserved. Many of them still have people's annotations in them. He offered a lot of stuff, basically anything he could get his hands on, as far as I can tell. Sample books. By the middle of the 18th century, there's a wonderful early 20th century one here that John pulled out with dyes and wools. But here's a fabric one. The idea of sending, as shops start to institutionalize some of the practices of auction houses, and increasingly from Amsterdam to Paris to Philadelphia, for that matter, display the goods, in particular cloth, and present a kind of visual menu of options. At the same time, sample books get sent all over the world where actual strips of the material can be seen, and one can order it wholesale or not. And again, the choice between these stripes, for instance, is not one about price or the moral good of one or the other. These tend to be the kinds of choices that are organized purely around preference. Consumer choice is initially a kind of mainstreaming of aesthetic choice. Trade cards do something of the same thing. Again, the trade cards often show shop windows. Trade cards are useful for figuring out where you want to shop. They're an early form of advertising. But again, you see the panes of windows being used to create kind of lots or visual cues, and dividing things much like that menu with all the different categories of things. I don't want to give the impression, though, this is entirely commercial. Parallel with the rise from the 17th and 18th century of these notions of commercial choice comes the idea of intellectual choice or choice in belief. There are many different ways of looking at this. You can look at library catalogs, you can look at, and they converge a little bit, but not entirely. Protestant Reformation helped stimulate this process, both accidentally by fracturing Christianity so thoroughly, but also slightly more deliberately with ideas of conscience and the idea of needing to, in a sense, choose what one believes. And the rise of commonplacing is, for me, a very interesting practice. Here's one of the most famous ones, John Locke's method, but everybody else folderizes Locke, and there are cheap versions of these, and people eventually do without. The examples here, people have done commonplacing without having to use a set formula. But again, they're kind of rules, they're objects you use. And why commonplacing? Because as people start to read widely, men and women, the idea of selecting which passages or which moments one likes, and in a sense, collecting what one has chosen rather than simply for study purposes, becomes standard for commonplacing. And then there's choosing other people. By the time of the French Revolution and afterwards into the 19th century, increasingly people less starting with the middle classes, more slowly for the lower classes and for the aristocracy, the possibility of selecting a partner for oneself for life becomes feasible. But the question is, how are you going to sort people? How will people do this without traditional modes of arranging marriages? And one of the great solutions, people try want ads, they try, marriage bureaus. These are just really precursors to online dating systems in every possible way. But one of the chief solutions is there are a lot of balls in the 18th century. If you read novels, you'll see people are always meeting each other at balls. Bad things happen, good things happen, exciting things happen. And how to even organize the process, an incredible amount of etiquette around the choice of whom to dance with emerges. And with that comes dance cards. The earliest ones like this are essentially erasable. This one's nice because it has the little pencil. Many of these technologies have a pencil attached initially. The pencil is often now lost, but this one you could write right on the ivory and wipe it off for another night. Later in the century, they're more often paper. Here's one, Montreal, 1860, where you see the dances have all been announced ahead of time, and a gentleman has to come up to the lady and request a specific dance and choose the dance and her and write his name in the right spot. That's one. And then finally, there's political choice, which you might think would be earlier in the story, but to my mind, the 18th century is actually not the great moment for the emergence of this modern form of political choice, because 18th century notions of choice are generally collective and they're about consensus. They're not really about the business of elections. There's not much discussion. The French don't even have a slate of electors in the time of the English don't think you really need to have an election very often, and only, they don't need to be contested very much. It's only sometime in the 19th century, and the Chartists are among the first to demand this, where the argument becomes that people, like these other domains, need to be able to actualize in privacy their own preferences without pressure from family, without pressure from above, without pressure from below. Mill is one of the great critics of this idea. He doesn't want to see this same ethos, this ethos of the shop or the ethos of the coquette or the ethos of the supermarket come to politics. He imagines a more moral version, like the Hercules model. He's on the losing side on that one, because the demand increasingly is for a technology that will allow the same kind of privatization and secretization around political choice. Here you have the Chartists imagining, and this is very similar to what's on the table here, which I think the example on the table here must have come from a private club using white and black balls. The expression blackballing somebody comes from voting against them in these kinds of setting. And the Chartists were very interested in trying to figure out what the process, the choreography should be, but also the balloting itself. Australia is the first place, though, to institute what we now consider to be a secret election in the middle of the 19th century, partly under Chartist influence. And the innovation there was the Australian ballot, as it comes to be known elsewhere, which looks a lot like a menu. It's a long list of names, and you put a check or an X. Occasionally, there are ones where you have to punch a hole, the opposite, to indicate your selection. You can see this one's a little daunting. This is a New York State election. There seem to be quite a lot of, it looks like those ones in Pennsylvania where you vote for all those judges and you've never heard of any of the courts and you've never heard of any of the people running. And you're like, okay, court of common pleas. I don't know, and just pick some. These are multiple parties. This one has symbols if you can't read the party name. But I should say, before this all sounds too liberating, these kinds of ballots were often used precisely to disenfranchise people, Native Americans initially, Black people, immigrants in the 19th century in the US, because the more you had to read, the harder it was to do. But this was a kind of, it takes until the almost 1900 before everywhere in the US votes with a ballot and not out loud in other forms. But this is a nice looking one, so I put this one up. And finally, the last innovation for the French, here's a French postcard. It's still so new in 1913, just before the First World War, that there are all these postcards and you can buy them on eBay. They're fun to collect. I found a lot of this stuff on eBay, I have to say. The secret vote. It's people performing this new activity of, you can see they're writing out their little cards, but they're doing it in public in a little private space that some people compared to confessionals or toilets or a variety of other kinds of secret spaces in public realm. By the 20th century, these modes have become popularized in all kinds of ways. Here's a ballot postcard that saves you a little time. Julia didn't want to write what was she up to, so she just checked some boxes. I miss you. I don't miss you that much. Glad you know, it's pretty here. It's not so pretty here, that kind of thing. These are all the samples I could find were in a pretty small range of dates, but you can see how this kind of ephemera, the same mode, starts to infiltrate other things. By the 1920s, there are even children's menus, you know, something we still have versions of. Much of this data, do you want to go back? Sorry.
No, I was taking a picture of that.
There, here, I will say this, that by the 20th century, what starts to really interest me is not just how these forms proliferate, but how we end up with sciences of choice. The modern social sciences have made, from marketing, psychology, economics, have made studying who chooses what, when, in what circumstances, kind of the center of what modern social science looks like. And much of that involved people taking this kind of data and doing things with it. I thought this graph was particularly amazing because the women have become the bar graphs. You see, they are the bars, and they're carrying their baskets. They are choosers, but they are also, they have chosen magazines, but they've also become, yes, part of the structure of the study. However, I don't see this as an entirely top-down story, because what's so interesting is how much ordinary people participate in all of this all along. They do things like this. Before there's advanced polling, the kind that we have now, magazines were filled with tear sheets. This one, again, was an eBay find. You know, it says, this is a secret ballot. Just mark your choices and mail it in and tell us, who do you vote for? What do you think? These were widely used for straw polling. People sent these kinds of things back in large numbers out of all kinds of, from supermarkets to magazines. People also went door to door collecting information. This is a particularly interesting study. Chicago is one of the hotbeds for this stuff in the teens and the 20s, University of Chicago in particular. This is why people chose not to choose. Why would people not take up the opportunity to vote if they could? And anybody recognize the Hollerith punch card form? Anybody know these? Some of you do, yeah. It's a kind of pre-computer technology where people were asked to choose various things in a survey, and then this was the kind of coding of their choices in order to therefore study choice making. But again, ordinary people participated by filling out all kinds of forms to make this possible. Finally, in the post-war era, choice expands beyond paper. This is the world of the automats. This is a postcard that I found somewhere or other, but it's a photograph, 1960, of a woman who's obviously meant to be very contemporary, very modern, kind of, you know, American style youth. And she's buying a record. Is anybody in here young enough not to know what a record looks like? No. Just getting nervous for a moment. A record from a vending machine. I don't have to tell you, it's obvious that all of this lives on today. If you go to Amazon and you want to do anything, first there's a menu, then you go through lots of things, then you click instead of check, but it's essentially the same thing. You put them into a basket or a cart, depending on what it, and then you take the things that are there and you bring them to the checkout. I mean, we essentially the paper form of the menu has simply been absorbed into modern life in ways that I don't think we spend a lot of time thinking about why we're, for instance, putting things in baskets. There's no need for a basket on eBay or Amazon or something, but yet that's how we roll. So what's the point of all of this? I'm going to conclude at this point by saying, since we're talking about the materiality in particular today, and I really want to emphasize that in keeping with the theme of this seminar, it's these material forms that I think both enabled this whole world of choosing and kept it always kind of rule bound and exclusive enough that there were always people left out and included. Some of this was to maintain social norms of various kinds. Some of it was to facilitate this expansion of choosing. But the thing that to me was most interesting about looking at these kind of surprising things like ballots and menus and dance cards was how much they ultimately, in conjunction with things like novels, how much they let me also return to some of these normative questions about how choice could simultaneously be liberating and constraining. And I think they make clear the way that when we talk about freedom of choice, we're actually always talking about bounded choices. There's no open-ended choice. There's no choice without rules. There's no choice without both interior and exterior limitations. And they remind us in some ways of the structuring and bounded nature of choice. That doesn't mean all choice is bad, hardly. There's lots of ways in which choice has been deeply liberating for all kinds of different people. But there are also many ways in which choice has been an important constraint and limit on the way we can imagine our futures and the way we can imagine freedom, for that matter. I won't say more about that now. I will just conclude with this thought that this doesn't seem like the stuff, this stuff on the table, stuff I've been showing you, that would yield really much that was particularly relevant to an intellectual historian. It's often thought that intellectual historians are quite far from the stuff of daily life. And that's always been a kind of critique of intellectual historians, that they only talk about kind of highfalutin ideas in the abstract and the important people who thought about them in some ways. But I don't think that has to be the case at all. That if you're interested more generally in trying to understand these kinds of doxic ideas, the kinds of ideas that run across the political spectrum, that undergird the way we live and the way we think in other ways, I think it actually pays to go back to the most material of kinds of texts and to try to unearth, and I think all of these yield clues to that effect, to try to unearth the ways in which ideas are already embedded in those material objects, but also the way those material objects continually shape our thought. And I'll stop there with that kind of larger methodological point. Thank you.
With the voice of Hercules as a master narrative so striking, because one thinks of maybe what the mythological master narrative up to that point may have been the Judgment of Paris, which you make a choice and you unleash the worst war the world has ever known. So it's interesting to think about the voice of Hercules eclipsing the Judgment of Paris.
Yes, it's true, because choices often leads to bad things in mythology and other, or Adam and Eve. I mean, there's a whole series of sort of the dangers of too much curiosity, too much choice making of various kinds. This is a particular form that it takes in the 18th century, this Hercules mode.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. A footnote and a comment. The footnote relates to the Australian camp. The American army, and actually other armies as well, during First World War I, issued cards to the soldiers to cross on, I'm well, I'm not so well, I'm only slightly injured, and to send it home. And that in some ways is reversing what you said about the novel, because it's not the novel that gives the choice, but that choice gives the story.
Yes, that's
Even if it's a reduced one. But my comment is about the novel. And I wonder whether something cannot be made of a very interesting point in time. When Samuel Richards was the printer who made his money by printing books that were not about choice, but guidelines how to write letters. They were supposed to be board so that you know how to do this. And the idea, how about putting such letters together so that they can form some sort of plot, and inventing the epistolary novel, so that you ended up from a genre that is not a choice but an educational how to do, to a novel like Pamela, that suddenly it features also a person who writes letters, puts it in her corset, becomes pregnant with these letters, has constant choices to make to flee around this castle, and gets to be made fun of in Shamila and other novels that make fun of her. So that is the kind of point for me where it kind of tips over, where something that is a rigorous guideline becomes just the opposite. And that might be
That's very
much what
interesting.
you're after.
Yes, I mean, that's a wonderful example, because that's absolutely right. It's always both. There's a way in which there are rules, and the novel is both about the rules and the breaking of the rules in different ways. I didn't use that example, but I did write a fair amount about Frances Burney's novels, and Evelina, for instance, is a little bit later, and that's when the sort of shopping emerges as a motif running through these novels. But the young heroine, she's about 17. She's never been asked to make up her mind about something before. And we think, how can she not? But this is completely unfamiliar. She comes to London and she has to make a choice about something, entertainments or something. And she says, how would I possibly do that? And she's made great fun of. And somebody says, what, would you have the dog vote before you? You know, that sort of, but you start to see that this is a kind of learned practice, and there are rules, but they don't answer all the questions for you. So I think that's wonderfully, apt, the idea that the epistolary novel is particularly important in all of this. Oh,
Zach,
yeah.
and then
Thanks very much. That was great. The early menus are really fascinating. And we also had a talk here a number of years ago. Someone who had learned a lot about menu engineering, where you place things. There's consultants obviously who do this for all kinds of restaurants, particularly chain restaurants. Where you place things on a menu determines what people choose in a lot of ways. So there's a kind of like false choice there. But I was, you talked about how one of the ways to kind of get at this ubiquitous idea of choice is through exclusions. Who was excluded? Another way that I was thinking about is I assume it grows up alongside, which is a kind of pleasure in the denial of choice. So you get menus, how long after do you get the idea of going to a restaurant for a tasting menu where you don't know what's coming and you put yourself at the mercy of the chef? There was a piece in the Times, the chef, for you, right? Back to the idea of stopping at an inn and you ate whatever they had. There was an article in the Times recently about like dating apps that refuse to let you swipe more than X number of times, right? The kind of anti-Tinder, which is to say that now, you've had too much choice, restrict the amount of choice that you get, and people want that, right? They want to sign up.
Absolutely.
You can see this in almost every domain, right? Shopping, there's also, you subscribe to a club. There's vegetables and it's always kale that arrive.
Yep.
You don't get to choose what you get, right? It's just, you get what you get. You don't get upset.
Right.
As my
I think-
kindergarten teacher used to tell me. So what is it?
Right.
There's clearly a dialectic
Right.
between, right? So what is that a kind of self-denial? I mean, in the religious domain, obviously you can go back to Paul's letter to the Romans. You can go back to where he says, I choose what I don't want. He has no choice. Or, you talked about Protestantism encouraging choice through scrutinizing one's conscience, but of course there's also the doctrine of predestination, which is meant to deny the capacity for choice whatsoever. So what do you make of this in the modern world? There's a kind of symbiotic relationship there, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so I didn't say much about this, but I try to also talk a lot about both kind of behavioral economists who have a lot to say about choice overload and choice behavior, and political theorists who also have a lot to say about choice these days. And of course, I read some of the popular marketing kinds of books, which tell you important things like the most famous one's a study about jams. Does anybody know this one? If you offer people in a store and you say, would you like a free sample of a jam on a little cracker? And you offer strawberry, blueberry, and raspberry, 3. Most people will say, oh, I really only like raspberry. Let me try that. And they might buy it. If you offer them 100 kinds of jam, almost nobody tries anything because nobody can deal with the idea that there are 100 kinds of jam and even begin, you just look at it and you walk the other direction. It's a little like, it's again.
I'm
it's
lucky I get paper towels.
That's right. It's that problem. And so
Children.
people with money have always paid people to help them make a lot of choices. So people like, instead of, Amazon, the curated boutique or the personal shopper or the travel agent or the money manager or the decorator. These are all professions that are basically helping you whittle down your choices. And now much of this is done by algorithms. So you go to buy a book and it always tells you either people like you like this book, or because you bought this last book, you'll like this one, or songs or music. So we both, this is part of the tension in the story, is this constant aspiration for more opportunities for choice and more options. And at the same time, a deep desire to have somebody help you pick. Because if you're at a certain point, it's not only stressful, it can lead to paralysis. And we all know that in our culture, making bad choices, you're essentially punished for it later. People say, well, you had a choice, and you made the wrong one, even if people had bad options to begin with. So choice is highly pressurized. So what interested me from the start was the idea that this is our modern form of freedom, and yet it's also so fraught. So we are constantly exempting some things from choice or limiting the options at the same time as we constantly say, well, if we had more school choice, if there were more choices in the menu, then there were more, that we'd be better off. So I think that's kind of the fundamental tension at the heart of all of this. So thanks.
Yeah, the example of the fabric book, if I may say, was so wonderful, because in some ways it's a rather sophisticated choice between different red and white stripes that you might like.
They were pretty close.
Yeah, but you can make the choice, but that's within the structure of fashion, which is dictating what you should wear.
Right.
If you're so interested in the fabric, your range of choices to be fashionable then as now, right, is coming from elsewhere.
So fashion, taste, these are regulative ideals that help you apart from the algorithms.
Thank you. It's just so stimulating and so much fun, and also touches on many deep and disturbing things. So I would formulate my general question and then just some associations with, could you say something about resistance to choice?
Yeah.
And the first thought that came to mind was the famous Yogi Berra saying that when you come to a fork in the road, take it. That's a materiality thing. So that the whole problem of decision making, can be addressed. This last week in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, is a reading about, I put before you this day blessings and curses. Okay, for you to choose. Choose life, choose blessing, don't choose cursing. And so in that case, choice is apodictic. So that's another kind of resistance to choice. I think about the unstated premise of the time period in which you're working, which a market economy creates structures. The market creates choices. And then you have profound reactions. Utopian socialists, Maoists. You have, people wearing the same clothing, doing things the same way, rejecting choice, rejecting the options of how to live your life and retreating, going off. So the general rubric here, and the last thing I just would say is, I wish you could say something if it's not too much about the word doxic. I mean, I think of toxic and I think of doxology and I think of toxic beliefs. And so I was wondering, what that word, just if you could fill out more about how you use the word doxic to encompass the idea of choice, because I'm not sure I fully understood. I think of it in religious terms and other terms. So resistance and doxology.
Okay, doxic I'll answer short. This is a brief answer, and I'm really just borrowing is the nicer way to put it, from Bourdieu here, which is the idea that there are some ideas that are not contested ones but so dominant that they sort of run underneath all our other struggles. I could call them also taken for granted ideas, or they tend to be tacit and they tend to be been absorbed to the degree that, for instance, we might say ideas about choice run across the right-left spectrum in the United States. There's school, you might fight about what we should be choosing, but not the idea that choice is a good thing. School choice, reproductive choice, for instance. So I'm only using doxic to simply mean this kind of idea. Ubiquitous would be one other way.
Yeah, but that's
Right.
all. My first point is
Yeah.
the question.
Right.
Second.
So let me come back to the resistance part. You are absolutely right that in any given moment, just as there are ways in which we fight against choice, there are whole areas of resistance to this. Nothing mows down everything in its path. And in fact, much of modern politics around the world could be described as a pushback against some of these notions of choice. Particularly, I think, around sexuality and gender is where we see it particularly at the moment. Let's take, for instance, the idea of the right to choice, which emerges among feminist organizations in the 1970s, right after really the decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973. And at the time, the various major sort of mainstream feminist organizations are trying to decide on a way to kind of sell this to the public. Population control, too radical. Women's equality, not likely to win a lot of votes. By the 1970s, it was assumed that the idea, it's a choice, would be the most palatable. You don't have to like it. You don't have to choose this for yourself. All we're doing is opening up more options. And this was thought would be to be the least controversial framing possible. Immediately, though, it was countered by two forms of resistance. One from the right, which said, which came up with this much more moralized language of life, which has a kind of value to it, that choice sounds a little like you went to the supermarket comparatively. So the one counter was, when something of a great moral nature is at stake, we need more Hercules than we need this kind of supermarket model, which you can imagine a whole bunch of things falling out of. It might be a cover for other things, but that's at least the framing. And from the left, often from more radical feminists, Black feminists, came, what does it mean to say there's a choice if nobody's paying for the option, if nobody's giving me the day off work, if having a child and there's no formal support for this, then a choice is kind of a fantasy idea. So you can see a kind of a right and a left resistance, I think, in philosophical terms, to the notion of simply expanding choice as the good. But there are many different kinds of resistance that exist to this. And so I'm certainly not saying that everybody believes in this, but it's very hard to be completely apart from it either, because resistance movements have to position themselves today in relation to this essentially doxic notion.
Thank you.
That makes sense.
Okay, Lynn Farrington and then Dan Rand.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating and great to think about. I mean, I think about, our toddler, 2 things to wear in the morning, because otherwise it's going to have complete chaos. Or I think about how we also, when we go into a supermarket, we tend to just go into certain places. Unlike Jerry, who spends a lot of time looking at paper towels, most of us go in and we know what we're after, and so we've limited our own choices, so to speak. But I want to
tell me what brand you recommend.
We just buy it at Costco, and you have a really limited number of things you can buy. But what I wanted to talk about was this idea, and Arthur pointed towards it, but the idea of copying, choice and copying, the relationship there, because I'm thinking back, women's fashion and women copying things that they see, or the ways in which people copy what's going on TikTok or other things like that. And that relation to choice is kind of interesting to think about there, how it seems to be a choice, but actually you're just taking on maybe another persona or something like that. So I just wanted to put that out there as something else that I was thinking about as you were talking about.
Yeah, some people love terms like self-fashioning, which I think don't really exist till quite relatively recently. The idea that you sort of turn yourself into type of some kind with your choices. That's not really what you see in these kind of 18th, 19th century models so much. You see copying certainly because people still want to make the right choice.
Yeah.
And there are all kinds of ways that that gets expressed. The difference is that it doesn't necessarily take the form as a kind of a universal like it is for the Hercules style choice. And of course, those kinds of choices continue onwards, just as other notions of freedom do as well. But the copying is certainly part of wanting to feel that you're buying the sweater everybody else is buying, but you decided to do it. And you were not forced to wear that sweater. You knew what was fashionable, say, or you knew it was on sale, and you autonomously made that decision. So I think they actually go quite well together.
Okay, Dan Raff, and then either Peter or Annie, I don't know.
I want to make I want to gloss an earlier comment and then make two remarks. The story about Yogi Berra isn't that he was a simpleton. He lived on a street that these were directions to his house. And he lived on a street shaped like a lollipop. So the point was, when the visitors got to the intersection, it didn't matter whether they went right or left. They would eventually get to his house. So here are the observations. First of all, I thought the remark about realist novels was interesting, but that I don't think that your point is at all confined to realist novels involving choice. It seems to me that any novel which involves the protagonist exercising agency is inevitably about choice. The ideas of choice and agency are very deeply tied up with one another. And that led me to a very striking turn of phrase you used in the beginning when you talked about the straitjacket of time. I'd like you to talk a little bit about what you mean by that phrase, because my first reaction to it was that the idea of choice not embedded in time was unintelligible. Choice is only interesting if there are consequences to choosing one thing rather than another.
Okay, thank you, Dan. The first about agency and choice. So I do look at novels all the way up to the present. I look at post-colonial novels. I look at all kinds of different novels, even some science fiction. So I agree that choice is not exclusively in the realist novel. I was just trying to sort of give an example of where I think it sort of takes off as a thematic for the modern novel. But I wouldn't say that every time there's agency, there's choice. Every time there's agency, there's some kind of decision making. But I'm really interested in very much this particular idea of choice as a selection that's preference-based from some menu of possibilities, either metaphoric or real. And there are decisions that don't have that kind of structure to them. And I'm particularly interested in these because I think I'm not trying to write about sort of all thought in all times and places. It's much more something about this fascination with selection from menus of various kinds. So I mean, it's an interesting point, but I do think you're absolutely right that novels of all sorts take up choice. And I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I was simply suggesting that's one of the places where it's most fully thematized. On the question of time, yes, choice has to involve time in the sense that there's a sequence of events involved in any choice. But the pattern by which political choice emerges, say, does not have to line up exactly with the pattern by which, say, romantic choice emerges. They have their own, in some ways, schedules, and they intersect at various points. But I didn't want to write a story that collapsed everything into, say, the story of the rise of capitalism, that everything just mowed down everything in front of it. And, you know, there's a sort of single strain. It's always tempting as a historian to try to connect everything in ways that give you a sort of unidirectional story. But I was simply cautioning against doing that when one has something as large at play as this, and to think about resistances, reversals, places that I mean, to this day, or you could talk about something like gay marriage that combine different modes of thinking about choice and biology in different ways. And I wanted to stay attuned to that. And I think one way to do that is to not insist that everything fall into a single chronology. That's really all I meant.
Peter or Annie, whichever one of you. Yeah, and then we'll go.
Thanks. Thanks so much. It was a really wonderful talk, Sophie, really fascinating.
Thank you.
I have just, first of all, I liked very much your use of Bourdieu's notion of doxa. I think, as I recall, he calls it the universe of unexamined assumptions. In other words, it's not something up for grabs. And when he actually talks about that, he actually makes the point that orthodoxy and heterodoxy are a kind of battle that goes on, which can expand the world of doctors. So that's how, the universe of unexamined assumptions can gradually get questioned and problematized. That's just what I'm recalling. But my question is about the menu with which you began, which is, such a fascinating example. And the question is, when do ticks and crosses emerge? In other words, a form.
Right.
And I'm particularly interested in ticks and crosses because sometimes it's a tick is positive and cross is negative, but other times they're just ways of making a mark. So if you've got a restaurant, if you've got a ballot or something like that, you can either make a tick or a cross. And so some kinds of forms, but other kinds of times, it's like Hercules's choice. Plus is virtue, X is vice. So I just wondered if there is a history of ticks and crosses, and if it relates in some way to your story.
Check marks. What a good question, Peter. That's a challenging question, and I wish you'd asked me this some years ago, because now I'm got to go figure this out. Obviously, there's a long history of marking one's presence, particularly when you can't sign, with some kind of mark, right? Of various kinds. I mean, this is, basic to working in any notarial records or something like that.
Right.
When forms start to emerge that require this, and whether they're an X or a check at the beginning, I'm just not sure. I don't know. Maybe I see Roger is here. Maybe he knows the answer to this question. No, sorry. Oh, too bad. See, I was hoping you were going to rescue me, Roger. Okay. It's a really interesting question, and I would have to go look that up and figure that out. I've never thought about that question. There's much discussion, though, certainly about how people are going to interact with these forms, even as late as the 1870s in England, when the first ballots for the first election for Parliament by secret ballot takes place. It's tried out first in the town of Pontefract, and everybody says, well, those people are so ignorant and illiterate there. How are they're going to be scared to go into a little booth and make their mark? And then there's much discussion that it turns out that even, the Times reports, even the yokel, it turns out, knows how to make a mark. And it's very unclear whether the marks are going to be legible to everyone. So there is some discussion as late as the 19th century about the kinds of markings people will make. But I don't know about the difference between a check and a cross and when the first forms are. I mean, it comes back partly to this idea of sort of the standardization, right, that comes with these sorts of, they're ephemeral forms, but they require standardized responses. And I don't have a good answer to that. So thank you.
Yeah, this is kind of a follow-up question, because I was also thinking about the interaction. And I was thinking how in the story that you're telling, I mean, the documents that you're interested in are so closely related to the ones that are doing precisely the opposite. So the things that are eliminating choice because they are exhaustive lists or inventories or catalogues or registers or timesheets or account. I mean, all of the print material that is being produced in the same print shops as the interactive forms that you're talking about, and that flops to the side, the other side, the one of work that you began with, right? So what distinguishes these documents is only that one of them, that one set of them allows for the interaction that puts them on the side of free time, whereas the other documents that actually look very, very similar are defining what it means to be in the world of work. So those ticks and crosses, they make all the difference, and they're not just about, they're not just happening in forms that ask for them. Like, there are many exhaustive library catalogues that people start using as sort of wish lists in the 18th century, even though they're not meant to be shopping catalogues. So there's something about this. And I think the novel is a very, I mean, my question is about the novel in that sort of logic, because the novel in a way belongs in the exhaustive list column, not the interactive one.
Yes.
And yet, of course, because it's about a world that's already been fixed rather than one that you can actually make choices in. I mean, unless you think about much later experiments with, you know, choose your own adventure and boxes of, you know, that can be played with. So it's an interesting object for you to choose as one of choice, given the binary between the interactive and the non-interactive dot inventory.
It's a fascinating comment, and yes, I couldn't agree more that the novel is essentially fixed, right? One has to enter its world in a certain sense, unless you get to somebody like, there's a wonderful recent novel by a Chilean novelist, it's called Zambra, that's written entirely in multiple choice form. And that's a kind of experiment that does put you back in that kind of interactive mode. But the kinds of novels we've been talking about are quite the opposite. And you're absolutely right. They thematize choice, but the reader has very little of that. Though I would say that when extracts are taken out and recorded of poetry or prose in commonplace books, in a sense, the reader is using the novel as a text that can be chosen from. So there are some texts, some reading practices that they're not what was intended probably by the author, but they do take much more the mode of choosing as their form. But you also point to something else I think is really important, and I didn't really probably say this enough, that it's not accidental that the workplace goes in a different direction than free time. I mean, we see this bifurcation as choices taking off and becoming a kind of horizon, a moral horizon where choice itself is the good. Abolitionists, feminists say, you know, people aren't given full human capacity if they don't have choice. They rarely say about what happens in the workplace. You might have choice to sign the contract. You might have choice of profession, but what happens in those hours on the workplace looks much more like what you're describing, a timesheet, say, is not a subject of choice. And I think that one half of that story is often told apart from the other, but they're deeply related. So it's not surprising to me that you're also pointing to the fact that the same print shop could be making materials that look like X and look like Y at the same time for different domains. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this really great talk. I just wanted to maybe possibly offer a complication to this idea of sort of a value neutral choice that we're seeing in the 18th century. Because when I think about the 18th century, I think a lot about the spectacle of the 18th century, right? So I'm also talking about the spectacle of choice, right? And to go back to Bourdieu, he tells us that especially we're trained to think along our class lines. So the choices that we make are bound up in our class situation. And it struck me that when we're talking about something like the commonplace book from Locke, it's not just that you're getting a set formula, you're getting a set formula from the intellectual of the time, right? So you're being told what your choice is actually. Or the novels that we were discussing, many of them are buildings romance, which were teaching us how to be a good citizen of the world based on our class or gender. So I'm just wondering how much of this idea of spectacle is also the spectacle of showing that one is able to make the correct choice is bound up in this.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's why I tried to suggest, and I didn't want to suggest at all that choice is in practice value neutral for, it isn't today. We make choices bound up with all sorts of moral desiderata. But I was thinking more at that point about this kind of shifting paradigms. That said, my point is also very much the same one you're making, which is that all choices are deeply bounded, and they're bounded by class assumptions. Yes, they're also bounded by all kinds of other considerations, religious teachings, family expectations, pressure from peers, normative ideas like taste, politeness, the pressures of advertising. I mean, these are all things that shape our choices. You know, there's a reason when I look around the room that we're dressed fairly similarly to each other. Because we are all products of various kinds of pressures. You know, nobody came in a giant caftan to the afternoon because it isn't what's done, right? I mean, or everybody's, you know, politely waiting their turn to ask a question, because we absorb all kinds of protocols all the time. And they're even more pronounced for women than for men always. And they were more pronounced in the 18th century than they are right now. But that said, I'm hardly arguing that free choice meant do what you want. I mean, I'm most interested in precisely what you're pointing to, the choice architects who, in a sense, structure the ways in which we decide up to even to the paper towel level.
I mean, you think about the novels of Jane Austen, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the novels of Jane Austen but a series of bad choice, bad choice, bad choice, bad choice until you get to the right choice at the end.
And they discuss choice a lot. And she always has people in choice-making scenarios. They go shopping in Bath, they go to balls, they do all the things that are modern, that are about choice-making, and they suffer the consequences of bad ones, and they toy with the options. I mean, you could, I think there are, you know, kind of game theory readings of Jane Austen, because she's just so much the novelist of this subject matter.
Thank you so much for this really evocative presentation. I'm coming at this from being a South Asia historian and working on print. And so I was particularly struck by the note that you ended on when you talked about how, like, the material form that these choices take are constantly acting on us as well. And in the South Asian context, one of the historical context, one of the ways that this gets illustrated well is in the form of the census and how the choice of having to choose, and this is partly talked about in terms of the fact that the census categories forced people who didn't necessarily identify as certain religious communities to identify as a religion, right? Where actually the rituals combined aspects of many different traditions. And so that made me think then about your question about how workers were working with forms that looked quite similar, and how the results of if you call census filling out choices, that the choices need to be digestible by workers. They need to be put into a form that is able to enter into the working world and become something, say something about the people who have made the choices. And then it kind of, your talk was so evocative, it took me down this rabbit hole, and I was like, yes, because really our choices, there's something that's happening with the world of print where our choices are becoming bureaucratized and sort of depersonalized from us, even as they're supposed to be saying more about us. We are kind of becoming a relief, and we make a choice, we make a mark on the paper, and that's supposed to be something that represents us. It's very Cartesian. The mind said something, the body does something, and this now represents something real that then workers can go and digest and do something with. And then that made me think about algorithms, right? And how our algorithms online are supposed to be kind of representations of who we are. So I guess I wanted to share this little rabbit hole I went down while I was listening to your this amazing conversation, and think about what you think about, is there space in this for thinking about, like, the role of bureaucratization and depersonalization of our choices from us? Does that fit into your conceptualization, or is it something that's kind of just off-piece and over here somewhere else?
Oh, yeah, your comments are making me think now, but especially about this idea about the census as a starting point is a wonderful example. If the menu has all these categories and you're sort of required to fit yourself into them and your very being, you know, what religion am I or what ethnicity am I? And these are categories that are not the ones you would necessarily ascribe to yourself, or maybe you check multiples, or the menu is in a sense determining your subjectivity in some way. That's a common feature of kind of modern life. And I can see a particularly pronounced case for this in South Asian context, but you could imagine versions of this everywhere. And people say, like, why are there, you know, politically, there may be reasons not to have a mixed race category, for instance, the United States, but many people identify with that category, and it doesn't, and they're not allowed that expression for reasons that are political, not about self in some way. One thing that modern choice-making behavior does is it turns us all into data all the time, right? So the women with the bar graph was an example of that, but even census data, I mean, we're and every stroke we make online, right, is we're producing information about ourselves as choosers every time we make choices. And I think your example is a particularly good one of how this particular kind of freedom to define yourself can be an unfreedom if the categories aren't the ones that you would have chosen. So I like that. I like that example very much. Thank you.
Zach?
Oh, I was thinking, this is kind of following on Tina's point about the novel, because I was thinking, you know, it's not just that the novel presents choice without giving the reader any choice, actually, but the novel is also like associated Don Quixote through, you know, the reading craze in the women's reading in the 18th century, with like the loss of the capacity for rational choice, with like mania and compulsion. And so I was thinking about compulsion as another another anti-choice, right? Addiction and compulsion. And certain kinds of, and then I was thinking about paper, right? Because like compulsion, also we associate a lot of times with paper, like hoarders, right? You think of a stack of newspaper, or as like think of like in The Shining, like remember he's just typing the same thing over the people who scribble, like scribbling on paper, compulsive, the kind of like there's some connection there between, right, like print production, maybe in the age of the novel, you know, you think about the 18th century print culture, like the kind of like abundance of production of print and the sense of compulsive behavior that exceeds your capacity for choice.
Right. I mean, so the critiques of the first women shoppers are all about how bad they are at it. And then it's about how bad they are as readers is a little later. But it's, you know, they can't make up their mind, or they make up their mind too quickly and just act on women fancy, or they want everything at once, and or they, you know, or they're compelled and they don't have any independent processes. So there's the critique, and it comes back again around suffrage, that women's minds, it's all the same critique of the reader, and originally the shopper comes back around suffrage, that they're gonna, you know, that they're not thinking about the right things, that they're compulsive, that they listen to other people too much, or they don't listen to other people enough. So there's the bad chooser is, you know, I think behavioral economists think they discovered this, but they really didn't, that, you know, that we're not that good at it, right? It's the longest critique ever. And the idea, and they only have to make that claim because rational choice theorists introduced the idea that there was such a thing as, even as a model of a consistent chooser whose tastes don't change over time, who makes choices in accord with their preferences in a kind of one-to-one match. Any novelist knows that's hardly the case. People always act against their own interests and things, and there were always critiques of that. So and the bad chooser is a thing all the way through this. What's interesting about the behavioral economists is they never suggest reducing the amount of choice. They just suggest kind of correctives, how to make us choose better. Whereas in earlier moments, there's more discussion of when choice should be activated and when choice isn't a good mechanism. But the gendering of this, I mean, is important all the way through, because women aspire to have more choices, even as this kind of choice gets pegged as feminine and therefore inferior.
Okay, last two questions, E. Andrews, and then I don't know whether it's Peter or Annie, but your screen. So D. There was a D. Leslie Rosario Olivo, sorry. So Leslie Rosario Olivo.
All right, cool. Yeah, hi. All right, my question is partly a comment, but the technologies of choice made me think a lot of this social control tactic that I use often in wrangling children into behaving, which is giving them a choice of something small, like, do you want to brush your teeth tonight with strawberry or mint toothpaste? But ultimately, you're forcing them into doing something, which is brushing their teeth, which they don't want to do. And I was thinking about this a lot, just like choice as a form of social control and presenting force as a personal freedom. And I was thinking about this in relation to algorithms too, data being a thing that is likely being leveraged for social control, algorithms, you know, creating assumptions and narratives about reality for us and limiting what we think is possible. And I work in artist books. And I primarily love them because of the idea of the Codex Unbound, which questions the idea of the book as a technology we can only engage in one particular way. It's not just a thing that is read from left to right and that you have to engage in from start to finish. It could be something like a box. And I was wondering if you have come across any different technologies that maybe resist, what's the word? Like that closed-minded approach to choice and inspire a more liberatory orientation in the body towards material reality, something that opens up the possibility of engaging with material reality.
You're asking the question of Marcel Duchamp in about 1915, which was, can there be kind of art without choice and preference, without the shop window, he said, as an idea. So in some ways you are asking the great question of the you know, the 20th century avant-garde, which is how can we create a work of art that opens up imagination but that doesn't resemble the shop window or the object, the one-to-one desire. And this is where Duchamp came up with things like the ready-made, which was deliberately a kind of way to thwart the kind of choice that you're talking about. So, I mean, your question's a really interesting one, and you could go back and look at much of the history of the 20th century avant-garde, also literary, not just visual culture, and look for places where the strategy was basically to evade what had become a kind of ubiquitous sense that everything was a kind of department store. So that's, and I'll just say this about your point about children. Yes, it's I mean, Americans are particularly strange in this regard. We're constantly, I did this with my own kids too. You say, do you want the Cheerios or the cornflakes before you go to school? Do you want to wear the red socks or the green socks while you must wear socks to go outdoors? But that whole ethos suggests that we're training them to be these kinds of liberal subjects, basically, right? In many places in the world, I've talked to people in various places, said, why do you give your kids a choice about a breakfast food? The family is eating breakfast. There's one breakfast. We all eat it. Why do you have to let them exercise this small bore kind of choice making, or give them allowances, you know, so that they spend a quarter for this versus that? It suggests all the time that they are in training to become choosers, which is become naturalized in a way. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not arguing that, but it is worth pointing out that it's not the only way that children get raised in the world. And, you know, that it's a very particular model.
Absolutely. The last question comes from Massachusetts.
Sorry. Is that...
Hi.
The question, I'm afraid I haven't read the book yet, so I'm sure you've got the answer. But the question is, when did elections become about choice? In other words, what I'm thinking about is a book by Mark Kishlansky called Parliamentary Selection. And his argument is that the whole point of elections in England in the 16th and 17th century was to avoid choice.
Right.
So was what you'd never want rival candidates. And so you try to avoid rival candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And you vote by acclaim. In other words, you have someone that is pre-selected. And the notion that it's not that there weren't ever moments of choice, but they're thought to be moments of breakdown. So it's a breakdown when you've got choice because it shows that there isn't social consensus. So the desire for the parliamentary process is actually to avoid choice and to actually reach consensus. So I'm just wondering when and where does the whole question of choosing this rather than that emerge in terms of political process?
So that's one of the central arguments of the book, is that it's quite late. And there have been people who've argued, that the 18th century age of revolutions, that sort of commercial choice and political choice just emerged together. I think that's quite the opposite of the case. It's just as you say, Koszlansky's vision of sort of early modern English voting lasts quite a long time, well into the 19th century in the English case, but it lasts also in places that had revolutionary traditions well into the 19th century. I would almost say there's a second democratic revolution in the late 19th century. I would time it with the secret ballot, because without the secret ballot, the vote is conceptualized very differently. It's, first of all, it's a trust. Only some people have it and they use it, they exercise it on behalf of others. That's already before. But with universal suffrage also comes a little bit later the notion that independent judgments need to be made and aggregated rather than a kind of consensual community norm. And that happens only with the agitation for the secret ballot. But once it happens, it's almost universal. Around the world, by the time you're in the 1920s, there's no such thing as a legitimate election. And to this day, anywhere in the world, if it hasn't been thought to be secret. And it's one of the only things that's regulated. Ages vary, all kinds of other criteria vary. But that, I think, is a profound shift in thinking about elections, as important as what happens in the 18th century. And I'll only say this, there's very little discussion of how to hold an election in the wake of the French or American revolutions. And that's because nobody really wants to imagine divisiveness. I think nobody really wants to imagine contesting notions exactly. They're held in a variety of different manners, but there's Condorcet is the great exception, but there's not much discussion about how to stage an election until the 19th century.
Yeah, I'm going to choose to end this session, although recognizing that I'm constrained by the clock and, but I also choose out of free will, not out of convention. Thank you, Sophie, for really well.
Thank you for all the really terrific questions, both online and in the room. And there's so much good. Sorry for the people online, but there's some extraordinary stuff to look out.
Voting boxes, typographic manuals for the world of fonts, and some yarn.